I see people are still filtering in, but in the interest of time and whatnot, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to thank everybody for attending our Constitution Day commemoration, and I'd most of all like to thank our featured speaker for today, Secretary of State Jason Kander, for coming and speaking to us about the Constitution. Jason Kander was sworn in as Missouri's 39th Secretary of State in January 2013. At 33, he is America's youngest statewide elected official. Just a few minutes ago we were talking and I mentioned him. I was putting this bio together and I realized that he and I were actually born on the exact same day in 1981. So interesting little factoid there. A former U.S. Army captain, Jason is a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. Prior to his election as Secretary of State, he practiced law, represented Kansas City in the Missouri General Assembly, and served on the Missouri Veterans Commission. He's a graduate of American University and Georgetown Law School and is married to his high school sweetheart, Diana. Their son, True, was born in September of 2013. And with that, I'd like to welcome Jason Kander to the stage.
Well, thank you, Professor Wesley. I appreciate it. Can y'all hear me, like in the back row? Yeah? Okay, great. Raise your hand if you're getting credit for being in class for being here right now. Okay. That substantially takes the pressure off of me to be entertaining, because I feel like you would have to be sitting listening to someone somewhere right now anyway. But I will try to be engaging anyway. So I really appreciate the chance to be with you. It is not just the beginning of a new semester, but it's an opportunity to celebrate our nation's Constitution, which I just found out is mandated by, Professor was just telling me, that's mandated by federal law, that in order for the university to keep federal funding for financial aid and that sort of thing, they have to have a Constitution Day. So anyone who is in here and is on financial aid, I am thrilled to be here to help you out. So if nothing else, I'm achieving that. But it's a great topic to talk about. The Constitution is, we always refer to it as a living and breathing document that really holds together our nation, not just in terms of how diverse we are as a people, but how diverse we are in terms of our opinions and our outlook on things. And we are really at a time where those issues that have traditionally been thought of as constitutional issues that are debated have seen a resurgence in terms of being within the public square, being issues that are really common everyday issues. And you just think about some of them, some of the ways that our Constitution is really tested on a daily basis right now. Some of the issues that you see when you turn on the TV and you see two talking heads, for instance, debating back and forth. They'll be talking about voting rights or same-sex marriage or reproductive rights or gun ownership. These are all issues that go right to our Constitution, and they make those issues relevant in a way that is sort of renewed every day. And so right here at home in our own backyard, I feel like what has gone on in Ferguson has brought a lot of those issues to the forefront. And it's made them not just issues at the forefront in Missouri, but really around the world, because that has become something that internationally people are watching. It's brought up issues like law enforcement methods or freedom of the press and equal rights and fair representation. And it's really reminded all Missourians, but really all Americans and even the rest of the world, that these debates haven't really changed over the years, that they remain relevant. And I think that there's really no doubt that what has happened in Ferguson could happen anywhere. It could happen in any city in America, but it also should be a reminder that if your constitutional rights, in any situation ever come into jeopardy, then mine do. And if mine do, so do yours. And that's really the entire idea of the Constitution, that it's not selective, it's not rights for certain individuals. I mean, as we've amended it over time, that's become even more true, that it really should apply to all Americans. And that, I think, is what that situation has reminded us of. And the events in Ferguson have also sparked these local and national conversations about voting. And that's sort of the piece of the Constitution that I'm going to talk to you the most about today. Lots of folks, pundits, reporters, everybody else, you probably have seen this on the news in the last few weeks as they talk about what's going on in St. Louis County. They will point out some of the numbers that we've gotten to know, like the voter turnout in the last municipal election in Ferguson. Does anybody know what it was? Since you're supposed to be in class right now, I'll call on somebody and ask. No, nobody's going to raise their hand. I won't do that to you. Wait, how many of you going to law school? That'll happen when you're in law school. People will randomly point at you and just make you answer questions, but I won't do it yet. The answer is it's 12%. That's what people keep pointing out. Is in the last municipal election in Ferguson, the voter turnout was 12%, which is obviously very low. And people point to that as sort of evidence of a lack of engagement prior to, and maybe evidence that there should be engagement in the future. But then people like to act as if that's unique to Ferguson. But it's really not. If you look at the rest of St. Louis County, we had an election, a primary election just a few weeks ago, and just 25% of the eligible voters in St. Louis County overall turned out. So that is a continuing issue. It's a continuing issue in terms of engagement, in terms of, frankly, our generation. You know, as the professor mentioned, I'm the youngest statewide elected official in the country, which means just barely I'm a member of the millennial generation, as are all of you. So this is a conversation about our generation, a conversation that you've probably seen when you turn on cable news or you read the articles about it. You see sort of the stereotypes that people throw out, not just your traditional ethnic stereotypes. You put those aside for a second and you talk about generational stereotypes, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with about our generation. Anybody want to shout any of them out? What are the things that people say about folks your age and to a lesser extent my age, but it's still the same generation? Lazy. What else? What?
We're disconnected from reality because of technology.
Okay, yeah. Relying on technology to the point where you're disconnected from reality. You're not paying attention to what's going on. What about selfish? Right? What's the other term other than millennial generation? What's the other term that they use? That's the one before us, but they refer to us as the me generation. Right? Have you heard that before? They say it's the me generation, and what they say is because your parents raised you, my parents, they raised us to believe that we were very special and going to do something great, and therefore we believe it, and we're the me generation. And what's interesting about that to me is that it's somehow a bad thing, the idea that we would aspire to do something beyond ourselves, that we would be a generation that has a tendency to connect what we do for a living with our personal identity, and that becomes important to us. I think that's a good thing, and I think that that's probably true for a lot of you. And so as people talk about issues like voter registration and voter turnout, one of the things they're talking about is whether or not our generation is going to engage, and I happen to believe that they are. I like to remind people that it is our generation that overwhelmingly over the course of 2 years and about 13 years, it's our generation that has, in a volunteer army, in a volunteer military, done most of the fighting. And that doesn't really sound like a selfish thing to do to me. And I think that we're a generation that is seeking to serve and seeking to help. And it's why it's always a thrill for me to get to talk to people of my own generation about the importance of engaging, whether it's in public service or just in voting. And returning to Ferguson for a minute, you know, in my conversations with the people on the ground there and in my visits there, it's really clear that there's a commitment not just to maintaining peace, but to working on real change, to working on that future and to engaging in that way. And a big part of that has become a push to increase voter registration within the community, to encourage everyone to participate in their state and local government out of a realization that doing so is really critical. And then there's an issue that I'm going to talk about for just a minute, and then I'm going to take your questions, because I want to mostly talk about whatever you want to talk about. But there is one thing I want to talk about with you, because I think it's an issue that you may not be thinking about that you really should and that you should engage on. Because before we can do any of these things, before we can make change through things like voter registration, before we can make change by engaging as a generation, you have to make sure that people still have the right to vote, the right to participate in the process. And a lot of you may or may not be aware what the official responsibilities of the Secretary of State are. I'll tell you a quick story, which is that when I decided to run for Secretary of State, I called up a family member and said I was going to run. And a lot of people, frankly, don't know exactly what the responsibilities of the office are. So I had a family member say, okay, so if you win, you'll be in charge of like foreign relations with other states, I guess. And no, that's not really what the Secretary of State does. Although, if It would be great if that were true, because I could run for re-election on us having not gone to war with Iowa or anything like that, which I think would be very helpful. But so one of the chief responsibilities of the Secretary of State is to be the chief elections official of the state, right? So I view that as two major responsibilities. The first is making sure that only eligible voters vote, and the second is making sure that every eligible voter has the opportunity to vote. Believe it or not, that second part is actually really controversial in this town, in Jefferson City, in terms of what goes on in the state capitol down the street. There are, how many of you are familiar with this issue? It's generally referred to as photo ID. Okay, well good, some of you are going to learn about it. So, unfortunately there is a group of legislators, a large group of legislators in our state capitol, meaning in the building down the street under that dome, who are really committed to the idea of making it harder, if not impossible, for some people to vote. And so they have this legislation that you've heard of called photo identification legislation, but that's really kind of a misnomer, because what the legislation really does is it requires a very specific, very narrow form of photo identification in order to vote. So for instance, how many of you have on you right now your Lincoln student ID, right? You couldn't use that to vote if this were to become law. How many of you have an older relative who has an expired driver's license but not a current driver's license, right? Several of you. Couldn't use that to vote if this became law. You know that card that you receive in the mail about 2 weeks before an election, tells you where to vote, it's your voter identification card? Couldn't use that to vote if this were to become law. I still carry, like a lot of veterans, I still carry my military ID, which has my photo on it. It's issued to me by the United States Army. It expired about a year ago, but it's very clearly a photo identification issued to me by the U.S. government. If this were to become law, I couldn't use that to vote in 2016. So it's a very narrow, very specific requirement. And if it were to pass, it would actually be the most extreme law of its type in the entire country. It would disenfranchise potentially 220,000 registered eligible legal Missouri voters. So that number is equivalent to 8% of the total number of people who actually voted for president in the state of Missouri in 2012. So it's a substantial number, right? And this is all happening right down the street, all right? They've been pushing this for several years. And, you know, if they were able to make it happen, what you would see is, as a result of the arbitrary requirements, you would see thousands of Missourians who have been voting for years and presenting identification already under the law when they show up at the polls, they'd be disenfranchised as soon as it happens. There are people, and maybe some of you have seen this, there are folks who when they go to vote, a lot of them are older Missourians, they go to vote, and when they go into their polling place, people know them. They know them, they speak to them on a first-name basis. They know them. And yet, under the law right now, they still present a form of identification in order to vote. A lot of those people would not be able to vote if this were to become law. So how many of you were aware of this controversy, as I've described it? Okay, a few of you, but not that many. So that's what's going on right down the street during the legislative session here in Jefferson City when it starts again in January. So this is, to me, pretty clearly wrong. But it's not just wrong. The reason I bring it up here is it's also unconstitutional. It is so unconstitutional, in fact, that in order to pass this law, what the legislature actually has to do is amend the state constitution first. So that's what they've attempted to do. I like to point out that if you have to amend the state constitution in order to pass a law, then that law is probably unconstitutional, right? It's kind of a red flag, you might say. Okay? So the reason that they would actually have to amend the state constitution in order to do this is because Missouri has one of the strongest voting rights provisions in a state constitution anywhere in the country. And I guess where I differ from the people who want to pass this law is I tend to take the view that that is something to be proud of and not something to be dismantled or something that needs fixing. I think that it is a good thing to have one of the strongest voting rights provisions in the entire country. And I think that rather than weakening our constitutional right to vote, we should look to strengthen it. And there's a lot of rhetoric on the issue, and you shouldn't let the rhetoric fool you. There's a lot of rhetoric where people say, it requires a photo ID in order to get a checking account. It requires a photo ID in order to check into a hotel. And so therefore, right? Well, that's all fine, and that may be true, but none of those things are actually in the Constitution. Those are not actually constitutional rights. And frankly, myself and a whole lot of other people didn't deploy to places like Afghanistan to protect your right to check into a hotel? Did it protect your right to vote, among other rights? And I think that that is a substantial point to consider in this debate. So if none of that persuades you, if you don't agree with anything I just said, you don't think any of those are good arguments, what I would also tell you is that in the state of Missouri, we have never had a case of voter impersonation fraud, which is the only kind of fraud that a photo identification law actually even claims to prevent. So we've never had a case of that happening. But it risks disenfranchising 220,000 registered voters if you do it. So it's going after something that has never actually occurred in the state and risking having 220,000 registered voters not be able to vote. So if none of the other arguments I made to you make any sense to you, at least that one should. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense at all. So I bring this up today with you because I can almost guarantee you that when the legislature begins again in January, they're going to try and make this happen yet again. They're going to go after it again. And last session when they tried, it was actually the 9th year in a row that they've tried it. So for 9 years in a row, we've blocked it. And I can't protect eligible Missourians' right to vote without help. And the reason that I bring it up today is not just because it's Constitution Day, but because there should be no mistake about it. The studies all demonstrate about this issue that laws like this disproportionately affect the African American community. They disproportionately affect the ability of those in the African American community to have access to the ballot. I bring that up with you because it's interesting to me that what will probably be the 10th year in a row coming this January that they bring this up, they're doing it in a place where they are just a stone's throw from a historically black university. And I bring it up to you because I am really asking you to engage in that fight. I want you to engage in that fight coming in January. I want you to pay attention to it. I want you to show up at the state capitol. It's right down the street. And I want you to make your opinion heard as they bring up this issue. Because all the studies demonstrate that it disproportionately affects the African American community. And this is a historically black university right here in the town where they are trying to pass the most extreme law of this type in the country to restrict the right to vote. And so I hope that you won't just show up. I hope that you'll talk to your friends about it. I hope that it'll be a topic of conversation, not just in class, not just as an academic issue, but as something that you bring up with the people who you live with the people who you hang out with, because it affects, whether you are African American or not, it affects you because you are a Missourian, and it affects you because you're an American with the right to vote. And it's something that should matter to you, because the reason that they do that, the reason that they continually bring it up, is because they genuinely think that you don't care. They genuinely believe that you don't care and that you won't do anything about it. And I'm speaking not just about the students at Lincoln, but about our generation and about those who would be affected by this legislation, no matter whether they are white, black, Hispanic, or otherwise. That they genuinely believe that you'll just let it happen. And so I would ask you to engage on it, to talk to your friends, and to make sure it happens. Because the vast majority of Missourians, they don't have any interest in seeing these sort of, in seeing the strictest law of this type, the most extreme law of this type in the entire country put into place, and doing it in a way that acknowledges that it's unconstitutional, then changing the Constitution to weaken the voting rights provision and shoving through the most extreme law of this type in the entire country. That's not what the vast majority of Missourians want. And you are here in proximity with the ability to influence that. And so I hope you will. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions, but thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it. So, yeah. Yeah.
So that gets put into place, a lot that you just talked about. Does it affect just Missouri, or does it affect the entire United States?
So if it's passed, it's something that a lot of state legislatures around the country have been trying to do, and it is a law that is in effect in some states. But if it is passed by the state legislature, it would only affect Missouri. That law would only affect Missouri. Yeah.
I want to ask you what's your name, sir, and what's your profession?
Sure. So I'm Jason Kander. I'm the Secretary of State for the state of Missouri. Jason Kander. I'm the Secretary of State. For those of you who came in after the introduction, I'm Jason Kander. I'm your Secretary of State. Nice to meet you. Yes, ma'am.
Why does it more so affect African Americans, the law affect African Americans?
Well, you'd have to, I'd have to get into the studies with you, and I'd encourage you to look it up. But there was a Wisconsin there was a federal court decision about a Wisconsin law that was a similar law recently that said that just based on looking at the demographics of who is less likely to have a current driver's license, it tends to be, if I'm recalling it right, it tends to be African Americans, and I think that the most substantially affected demographic was older African American women were most likely not to have a current driver's license or current state-issued photo identification. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm from New York, and it's like, it's mandatory for us to actually have a photo ID. So why is it not easy?
You're saying it's in New York, it's mandatory, you said?
Like, everything you do in New York, you have to have a photo ID. So,
But I don't think it's state law that you're required to have
it's
it.
not state law,
Yeah.
but a lot of people say, like, even they have it on the news that it's like, the court, you have to say ID. So,
Well, sure, I mean, I'm in no way saying it's not important to have an ID, but there are people who don't. I mean, for instance, my grandfather is 90 years old, and how many of you have had the experience of talking to an older relative about perhaps they want to consider not driving anymore? A few of you? Okay. My grandfather, we call him Pop. 2 years ago, Pop was in his driveway, and he mistook the brake and the gas, and anyway, he needed to get a new garage door. Yeah, is what happened. And afterwards, I was talking to him about it, and I said, Pop, that could have been really bad. And he said, well, imagine how bad it would be if I'd hit something I was not aiming for. So he still drives, and he's going to turn 91 on Veterans Day this year. He served in World War II. So the idea to me that somebody like my grandfather, for instance, would have to, when they're considering whether or not to give up their driver's license, have to also consider whether or not that might mean giving up their right to vote because they don't have that state-issued photo identification, that very narrow form. To me, that's wrong. And so that, most of us do not know people who don't have a photo ID, but the numbers don't lie. There's 220,000 Missourians who are registered, legal, eligible voters in the state who don't have the very specific form. Because remember, it's not any photo ID. It's one very specific form of photo ID. Yeah.
so say you don't have a photo ID, will you use your passport to vote?
Depending on what the law actually says that they pass. So I want to be really clear. This is not the law right now in Missouri. This is the law that the legislature has tried to put in place for 9 years in a row. But it's not the law right now. But you do have to have identification, just not this very narrow form. So who, go ahead, yeah. Over here, okay. Sorry. This motion means I've had my arm up for a long time. I apologize.
It's been up since the end of the speech.
Okay, go ahead.
I actually have two questions, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
One, even without this law impending, do you believe that somebody has to absolutely show some form of photo identification for each vote, no matter what?
Do you mean right now?
Yes, right now. If you go to even a preliminary or just you're electing your mayor, you have to have some form of photo ID. It has to have your photo.
No. Under the law right now, you have to show identification.
Okay.
That's the law right now.
Because I have seen some people in my city trying to get away with not having to show their driver's license.
Well, that's
or
the law.
Voters insurance.
The law right now does not require you to show a current driver's license. The law right now, which is still one of the more restrictive laws in the country, as it exists right now, requires you to show, and you can go to our website. There's a few different forms of identification you can use, but it doesn't require this very narrow form that the legislature is pushing. Go ahead and your second question.
Recently, there was a law on the ballot for a new amendment amending the Constitution to protect gun rights. Earlier, you said if you have to amend the Constitution, it's more likely that the amendment is unconstitutional. Do you believe that this amendment to protect gun rights is also unconstitutional?
Well, let me clarify what I was saying. So what I was saying was if you have a law, like a statute, that you want to pass, and the only way you can pass the statute is if you change the Constitution, then that means your law is probably unconstitutional. So that was more about changing the state constitution and not about passing a specific law. So it's kind of a different issue.
But they want to change the state constitution to include that it has to be protected by state rights. Do you believe that this should fall through?
Well, it passed.
Oh, okay.
So, anybody else? There were some other hands up. Yes.
Why do you think our generation is not that big on voting?
You know, so the question was, why do I think our generation is not that big on voting? That's a misconception that is pushed sort of in the conventional wisdom, the idea that they're not. And I don't have the statistics in front of me, but if you look, our generation is an increasingly large percentage of the vote in each election right now. And really, as members of our generation get a little older, obviously right after folks, the bulk of the generation turned 18, like any generation, they hadn't really engaged and started voting in high numbers yet. But as, I'm the senior set of our generation. My age group really is voting at a pretty high rate right now. And so it's actually a misconception that is really put out there, the idea that our generation hasn't engaged and really isn't voting. I obviously want our generation and every generation to vote in higher numbers and in higher percentages. But it's actually, I'm glad you asked that, because it's something that a lot of people believe, but if you look at the numbers, it's not really true. That it really is the case that our generation, from an electoral standpoint, is something that cannot be ignored. You really have to, if you're a candidate for office, I believe, and this is going to become only more true in the future because we're also population-wise the largest generation. If you ignore the concerns of the millennial generation, I think it's really a huge electoral mistake. So it's actually really encouraging. Anybody else? Go ahead. We'll take a couple more and then, yeah.
Well, I was going to ask, okay, so if voter identification cards become moot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then what would they still send those? What would the point be? And there would have to be an alternative other than driver's license, right? Because not everyone drives. People live in the city, people use public transportation. It's crazy to expect everyone to have a driver's license. So
See, now what you're doing is you're applying common sense. Sometimes when you're talking about politics, that unfortunately is not part of the equation. And that's kind of, I think you nail the point, right? What you're saying is if they were to pass this law, if they were to change the Constitution and pass this law, well then clearly there would have to be another avenue to let these 220,000 registered voters vote. Clearly we'd come up with something, is what you're saying, right? And the answer is that applies common sense, and that's not the point of what they're doing. What they're doing is they are looking at things like constitutional rights, and they are applying political motivations to it, right? And common sense doesn't get involved there. And it's why you should be so outraged by the idea that this is being considered, that it's been attempted for 9 years in a row, that it's going to be attempted for a 10th year in a row, because there is no common sense you can apply to that. I tell you that because the sort of architect of conservative judicial philosophy, modern conservative judicial philosophy, is a guy named Richard Posner, who is a federal appellate judge. And he wrote the opinion in the original photo ID case in, I think, 2006, came out of Indiana. And in that opinion, he said, he authorized it. He said this would not be something that would violate people's rights. He wrote a book last year where he said that was one of his biggest regrets, was that opinion that he wrote, because he believes that it has violated people's rights, that it is something that restricts people's right to vote, and it does so without addressing a problem that has been documented. Because voter impersonation fraud is a kind of fraud that, as I said, for instance, in Missouri, has not happened. So my point is that when you apply conventional wisdom, when you apply common sense, rather, you get the question that you're coming up with. But that's not what's being applied, unfortunately, which is why I talk about it so often. It's right over here.
It's not so much of a question, it is a question, but a statement too. My mother's 74 years old. She does not drive anymore, but she's issued a state ID, which is passable as a driver's license.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to actually have a motor vehicle license, and you are given something. My question to that is, it's being as an American, as a Missouri citizen, being held accountable for being responsible, whether you're black, white, or Mexican, to have the ability to have these things set aside for yourself, to have an ID, because there's many things in life that you're going to need it for.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't really feel that it's like, so don't you think it's a little discriminatory to say that they're not held accountable to have an ID? Because age, or because of, you know, you feel that they don't vote more or something like that?
I think that the proposal is, I think it's discriminatory. I think the proposal is. What your point is saying that people should have a responsibility to do these things. Do you know when that, you're saying your grandmother?
My mother.
Your mother?
She's 74.
Do you know when it expires?
It expires the same as a driver's license.
Right.
So like if she gets it, it's 5 years.
So when it expires, do you consider that to be any less proof that she is who she says she is?
No, but when she gets the notice, like to get it renewed,
Right.
she does that.
But my point is, so does she have a car?
Yes, she does.
Okay. Does she work?
No, she's not.
Okay. So if she didn't have a car, and if she worked for a living, then now not only do you have to, in many cases, pay for underlying documents in order to get it, right? You have to pay money to get, if you don't have your birth certificate, or if you're a woman, for instance, who's changed her name because of a marriage or a divorce, you have to pay money to go back and get all that paperwork if you don't still have it. So then you're paying money in order to retain a constitutional right. But if you work for a living, then now you have to take off work. How many of you have gotten in and out of a DMV in like 5 seconds? Right, and if you're working, you're missing time, right? So now you're paying money there too. If you don't have a car, now you're paying money for public transit. So that's my point, is that it is a constitutional right, and to throw up those roadblocks is wrong. If it were just a matter of you could use your student ID, you could use, that would be a different question. But it is a matter of when that ID expires, as you agreed with, that ID doesn't become any less accurate of a representation of who you are, and yet you couldn't present it, which doesn't make any sense. It goes back to not utilizing common sense. And when they're not utilizing common sense, it makes you think about what would the other motivation be. Let's do, yes, sir.
I just had a quick question and comments as well. As far as earning your right to vote, that seems like an interesting construction to me, because traditionally the way the Constitution is framed, the way that we have understood our rights, is that we have these rights and governments are not allowed to restrict those rights. We have them by virtue of having belly buttons. We are born and we have these rights, and we keep our governments from restricting those rights. And so the idea of earning your right to vote or earning your right to speak freely strikes me as a rather interesting way of thinking about it, and a way that has not been traditionally the way that we think about our constitutional rights. But I also had another question for you, actually.
Can I talk about that for just a second, then answer? Because that's a great point. And to the extent that you look at it in the sense of whether, or, you know, if it is an earned right, which I agree that it is a right that you have as an American citizen. I like the expression of you're born an American. I think you said with a belly button. Right.
That's the way we used to think about
so,
it. You are a person.
In addition to that, it's not just that; it's also a right that's been fought for us. I mean, there are people who are on a bridge in Selma. There are people who went to jail. There are people who died. And I'm not just talking about people who went overseas to fight. I'm talking about people in the civil rights movement who gave their lives to make sure that people would have these rights. And the idea that in 2014 and next year in 2015 that we're still having that debate is discouraging. So anyway, but you had a question.
I was also curious as far as your opinion regarding, maybe we can call it creative districting.
Oh,
In
sure.
the state of Missouri and around the country, and what that does to impact a person's right to vote.
So you're talking, it's redistricting, or some people call it gerrymandering.
Right, exactly.
How many of you are familiar with this issue? Okay, so for those of you who aren't, it's the issue of the way that legislative districts are drawn, the way that the boundaries are drawn, and politics often become very involved in that, in terms of affecting what sort of a legislative body you get, whether you draw a district to include more Democrats or more Republicans or more of one ethnic group or another. I really think that, when you look, for instance, at our congressional process for doing it, it really needs to be a process that should be taken away from the legislature. And I would say that whether it's controlled by Democrats or Republicans, because I think those districts don't belong to legislators. They don't belong to members of Congress. They belong to the people who live in them. And they should be drawn in a way that most fairly represents the state. We have term limits in Missouri, so you can only, for instance, in the state house, you can only serve 8 years. You can serve 4 terms. Well, the districts last 10 years. So it's always interesting to me, because they do it every census. They redraw them based on the change in the census. So it's always interesting to me that, around redistricting time, you can go to the legislature and you can hear legislators referring to the district as, well, that's Mike's district, or that's Bob, based on who the representative is, which is fascinating to me because they don't even last as long as the district. So the idea that you would consider who currently represents a district when drawing the district, to me, is ridiculous. All you should consider is what most fairly represents that area and what's most fair to the state. Anybody else? Yeah. Let's go here because you didn't ask one yet, and then we'll go back.
Since you run the state, basically,
I have a piece of it.
If I go, you're suggesting that a state or a driver's license that expires is okay to vote.
Mm-hmm.
So if I get pulled over driving down the road with an expired license, do I come up to your office and say, I don't deserve this ticket?
Well, you can, but I'm probably going to tell you that I'm going to work to protect. No, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to work really hard to protect your right to vote, but that you should pay your ticket.
Why should I? Because it's an expired ID. You take expired IDs to vote.
I think
can't use it to drive.
Because driving is a privilege not enshrined in either the state or U.S. Constitution. No, voting is not a privilege; it's a right.
Oh, okay.
So that's the difference. Yeah, that's the difference.
So you're an educated man. you know the word politician. You know it kind of twisted.
Well, I'm not twisted. I'm just telling you the facts.
You twist them up.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not trying to steal your thunder or anything, but I do teach this stuff.
Yeah, take my thunder.
So I'm not a politician, and I can tell you that you have to take a test to drive. You don't have to take a test, thank God, anymore to vote.
Right. Yeah, I'd applaud that. That's good. I appreciate it. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Quick question.
Okay.
Could by chance the law be more to prevent, and I don't know if anyone here is, but to prevent illegal immigrants from voting? I've heard just on rumor. I've just heard on rumor that if you're an illegal immigrant and if you work for the state, either legally or illegally, you can still get a state ID or a driver's license, but only passports or certain IDs can be given to American citizens. People who've taken their oaths or were born here. So could it be more towards just protecting a U.S. citizen's right?
Again, what you're admirably trying to do is assign a common sense reason to this. And the truth is that's really not what's going on. It's not about that. It is about people playing politics. Again, there's never been a case of voter impersonation fraud in the state of Missouri, and passing the law risks disenfranchising 220,000 registered voters.
I meant more in general for the country, because usually if it starts falling in a few states, it starts falling in others.
Well, I think the last study I saw said that over the last however many elections, nationally, I think there have been something like 30 cases of voter impersonation fraud. So, again, and then when you look at, I think the Wisconsin decision actually pointed out that there had been several, many cases under the law of people who they could document would be disenfranchised from voting, as opposed to. So it's, I focus on Missouri, obviously, but again, it's one of those times where if you try to assign common sense to it, you are going to rationally try to find a good policy reason for it. But the truth is that it's not there. It's just not. Anybody else? Okay. Thanks, guys. I really enjoyed talking to you. I appreciate it. Thank you.